Hi everyone, my name is Emily Wright and I'm presenting my honors capstone thesis titled The Future of the European Union in Eastern and Central Europe, How the 2015 Refugee Crisis Impacted Euroscepticism in the Visegrad Group. So briefly, what I'm going to cover today is why I chose this topic, the ECE, or Eastern and Central Europe, and the EU and free movement and the different policies, Euroscepticism as a general term, the V4, also known as the Visegrad Group, and Euroscepticism, what the refugee crisis was and how it impacted Europe, the V4 reaction to the refugee crisis, and a brief analysis and discussion. So I chose this topic because I am an international studies major and my concentration is on Europe and the former Soviet Union. In the spring 2020 semester, I was studying abroad in Strasbourg, France at Sciences Po under both Professor Wachtenberg and Professor Paolo Vecchio. I took many different classes, but two of the most impactful where I started this research was political sociology of the EU and European integration. Both of these were heavily focused on Euroscepticism. Most of my research was focused towards Eastern Europe, and I did have the chance to travel there. So on the right, the lower picture is from a rooftop in Bucharest, Romania, and the other picture is me in Strasbourg in front of the cathedral. So Eastern Europe and the EU have always had a fairly complicated relationship after the fall of the Soviet Union and the change from communism. Most of Eastern Europe was looking towards joining the EU. They wanted to become more democratic. As a blanket kind of idea, they saw anything from the West as good. This included the EU, anything from the East as bad. And I am aware there are several nuances to this. This is just like a general term. However, this idea did lead to a high degree of disillusionment. They had a very difficult time integrating, not only culturally, but especially economically. There was a hard transition going from a socialist economic system to the European Union's free market. The V4 was originally the V3. It was Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, and when the Czech Republic broke up, it added Slovakia to the V4. So this group of countries came together to help gain membership. Originally, Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary were doing the best, as Slovakia during the late 90s did take a hard turn towards authoritarianism. However, by 2004, all four countries were admitted to the EU. After this, cooperation was stalled, but they started working together after the 2008 economic crisis. So the EU was founded on the idea of free movement. It began with the free movement of goods, and the free movement of workers, and after the free movement of people. If you've ever traveled to the EU, you know the Schengen area. Once you're admitted in one country, you're allowed in the other countries. And this was kind of established with the Dublin Convention of June 1990. And is one of the main components of the Common European Asylum System. The Dublin Convention was modified several times, the last one being the Dublin III regulation, which was passed in 2013. This identified what country was responsible for examining any asylum application. In April 2016, during the middle of the refugee crisis, the European Commission set out different options for reforming the asylum system as they saw it was not working. The main idea that was set forth was the initiative on relocation, meaning that each member state was responsible for taking a certain amount of refugees. This had very many different reactions, as you can imagine. However, national parliaments of 6 different member states, which did include all of the V4 states, said that this idea of relocation did not comply with the principle of subsidiarity. So Euroscepticism is a type of populism that puts together both anti-EU sentiments with a populist understanding of the world. There is a very big difference between soft Eurosceptics and hard Eurosceptics. The soft Eurosceptics want to remain in the EU, but see that there's many issues with it, and they would like to see reforms. Hard Eurosceptics, for the most part, want to either leave the EU or want the EU to dissolve. And there are a lot of different parties and beliefs that ride the scale between the two. Before 1992, most of Europe was operating under a permissive consensus, meaning that they didn't really care what the EU did. It wasn't their issue. They were going to be fine with whatever they did. However, in 1992, again in 2005, with the failing of the passage of a constitution, and in 2008 with the economic crisis, and again in 2015, this was no longer the case, and we see a lot of different trends rising and falling with those different crises. Especially the 2008 crisis was a huge turning point for the EU. The refugee crisis did make the issues of integration more obvious, and today Euroscepticism is present in almost every single member state. So the V4 in Euroscepticism has an interesting relationship as well. Euroscepticism has been present in the ECE since they joined the EU. Their Euroscepticism is based on the fear of losing national culture, tradition, and religion, and for the most part is a criticism of globalization. In Hungary, Euroscepticism was not a mainstream idea until the 2010s. Prime Minister Viktor Orban took power in this time, and he started giving speeches against Brussels in 2011. He promoted a heavy us versus them rhetoric, and there were even billboards along the sides of the road making fun of Brussels and saying that Brussels did not care what happened in Hungary. In the Czech Republic, before the refugee crisis, already almost all the parties were at least soft Eurosceptic. They are considered kind of the problem child of the EU, and this can be seen through their elections as well. Poland is probably the least Eurosceptic of the V4. They perform the best economically, and they are well known for having one of the most successful transitions post-socialism. Slovakia, Euroscepticism wasn't very present until the 2008 economic crisis, and again, like several different members of the ECE in the EU, they were hit disproportionately by this crisis. So the refugee crisis was a result of the Syrian civil war that began in 2011 as part of the Arab uprisings that took over much of the Middle East and Northern Africa. This civil war, however, did change into a proxy war where different states got involved, including the United States, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, the UAE, and many more. On top of the state actors, there are also non-state actors, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and many different other parties. With this proxy war, civilian infrastructure and civilians were disproportionately targeted. This led to the refugee crisis, and from 2015 to 2016, almost 2.7 million refugees arrived in Europe. And at this point in 2015, 1 in every 113 people in the world was considered a refugee, which is an absolutely insane statistic. Most of these refugees from Syria arrived to the EU in Greece, Italy, and Spain. They would either come through Turkey or they would cross the Mediterranean. The European Agenda on Migration introduced the idea of refugees as a shared responsibility, and similar to the relocation idea that became about a year later, the West was fine with this being a shared responsibility, the East was not fine with it. So the V4 before this refugee crisis had very little experience with migration. Slovakia was the only one who really even had a minority population. They were a very homogenous society. As a group, they did refuse to accept the relocated migrants. There was little variance in this, but for the most part, they were not for this idea. They believed that the acceptance of migrants would dismantle their cultural and religious symbols, especially with the idea of Islam coming into these heavily Christian countries. All four saw an increase in populism, and there was heavy rhetoric that linked migration with terrorism throughout the V4. In Hungary, there was a very inflammatory reaction to this crisis. Again, like I mentioned earlier, they were led by Viktor Orban since 2010, and there was already heavy discourse against the EU, and as you can imagine, this only increased. There was a 175-kilometer fence built along Hungary's southern border with Slovakia, and many other ideas that were not present in Western European states at this time. The 2019 European Parliament election showed that Viktor Orban's party won absolute majority again, and not only did they win, they increased their share. They held 13 out of the 21 seats available to Hungary, a clear majority. And their only campaign strategy was to talk about migration and the dislike of the EU. There was not much else mentioned throughout this election campaign. We move on to the Czech Republic. They were fortunate enough to avoid most of the fallouts from this refugee crisis. So I included this map here to show where the Czech Republic is located, and you can see that if the refugees were arriving in Greece, they more than likely were not going to hit the Czech Republic. They were also very against the relocation idea. However, they did end up taking a couple and now are on better terms with the European Commission than the other members of the V4. However, they have always had a difficult relation with the EU. Like I mentioned earlier, they're kind of seen as a problem child, and this still hasn't changed, even though they did take a couple refugees. In 2019, their biggest winner for the EP election was the Civil Democratic Party, a well-known critiquer of the EU, and the public, for the most part, agrees that they want reforms in the EU. They're not happy with the direction that it's going in currently. Move on to Poland. So at the beginning of the crisis, Poland was not under the control of the Eurosceptic Party. However, in 2015, the Law and Justice Party took over. They saw the EU as a manifestation of the incompetent political elite. And one of the more interesting ideas that came out of Poland at this time was that it was the West's fault for this war. So the West colonized Syria, the West became involved through proxies, and then it was the West's fault for the refugee crisis, meaning that Poland should have nothing to do with it. This should all be the West's problem. They also wanted to stand by their Christian values, which they basically just meant by this is they did not want Islamic refugees. In March 2018, Poland still had not taken a single refugee, and the same year, 51% of the population did support leaving the EU if that meant they had to take a refugee. However, the 2019 EP elections did not go how you would think they would go. The Law and Justice Party did win a majority of the seats. However, they did not really keep up their anti-EU rhetoric. The only thing that was mentioned against the EU, for the most part, was just not joining the Eurozone, which the country is doing well economically. They don't see a need to join the Eurozone. The Law and Justice Party did win over 45% of the popular vote. And lastly, the country of Slovakia. Like I mentioned earlier, they're kind of the only one who has experience taking in a minority population, especially the Roma people. However, they still want a homogenous society. They promoted anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic rhetoric throughout the entire refugee crisis, and they compared the relocation initiative to a dictatorship. And the parties did become more Eurosceptic after the crisis, and the 2019 EP elections showed that hard Eurosceptic parties did win a majority of the seats. You can see in this graph that I included that there was a sharp drop in trust in the European Union around the economic crisis, and they've kind of gone back and forth, but average around 50% in Slovakia. So the European Parliament elections as a whole, from 2009 to 2014, the main European skeptic parties only held 17% of the votes for the EP. 2014, they were at almost 23%, and by 2019, they were at 25%. So almost a quarter of the members in the European Parliament are a part of Eurosceptic parties. Even now, mainstream parties in Western countries have Eurosceptic themes, including Germany, Spain, and France. So for my analysis and discussion, I do want to point out that Europe was already seeing a trend towards Euroscepticism before the refugee crisis. The crisis of 2008 was the sharp increase moment for the EU. However, it not only increased with the 2015 election, it was like a sharp increase. This is because these crises both disproportionately affected the ECE. They were not able to handle these situations. All four V4s saw an increase in Euroscepticism and populism, and this can be shown in the results of their elections and their rhetoric. And the V4 in the EU, they will probably stay in the EU. There's not a huge movement to leave. They're not really wanting to pull a Brexit at the moment. However, it is likely that there will be continued discussions about the ECE's role in the EU's role in the ECE. So, thank you.